Dear Cyrus, dear family, dear friends, dear colleagues, on behalf of the rector who excuses herself, I would like to warmly welcome you at this inaugural lecture. Today, Professor Cyrus Mody will formally accept his position as Professor in History of Science, Technology and Innovation at his university, and more particularly at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. The title of the lecture is Towards a History of Science from the Perspective of Applied Science. This is not only a very intriguing question, it's also a question for which Cyrus is very well placed to answer. Professor Mody, the floor is to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sophie. Dear colleagues, friends, loved ones, I know the custom in these inaugural lectures is to lay out an intellectual program first, and then to thank one's friends and colleagues at the end. But if you'll allow me, I would like to break that protocol today, for one particular reason, which you'll see in a moment, but also for the more general reason that the personal and professional, the intellectual and the emotional are not separable. The intellectual program that I described today is the work of many people, whether they know it or not, and so I'm compelled to thank at least some of them right at the outset. That means thank you to my local colleagues for welcoming me to Maastricht and creating an environment in which I feel really useful and happy. Thank you to Karen and Daria for being willing to try something new and for taking to our new life here with relish. Thank you to the friends we've made here. And thank you to my wider network of professional friends, some of whom are here today, and many are elsewhere. I'll try to make my remarks lively, and more importantly, brief, so that we can move to the more conversational stage of today's proceedings quickly. I also need to thank someone who is not here, Anne Johnson. Over the past 10 years or so, I was privileged to work alongside Anne and a tight-knit group of colleagues affiliated with the Center for Nanotechnology in Society, particularly Patrick McRae, Matt Eisler, Mara Mills, Hyung-Sub Choi, David Brock, and Amy Slayton. I fully expected Anne to be at the center of that group for many decades, but instead, she passed away in December after a too-brief battle with cancer. For many of us in STS and in the history and philosophy of science and technology, she was a friend, mentor, collaborator, and inspiration. We were lucky to know her. We're lucky still to work with her ideas and her precepts for how to be a humane, engaged colleague. But of course, we also miss her a great deal. When I was struggling to come up with a theme for this lecture, I found myself returning over and over again to a couple essays in which Anne posed this question: what if we wrote the history of science from the perspective of applied science? And just as I came to the conclusion that yes, that's the question that I've been trying to answer for most of my career, Anne's condition worsened. So I would like to dedicate this lecture to her as an acknowledgement of both a personal and professional debt. Now, I won't claim to answer Anne's question today. So my lecture is just toward a history of science from the perspective of applied science. I'll begin by defining some terms. I'll show that we don't have enough answers to Anne's question, and I'll speculate as to why. And then I'll tell some stories that show why Anne's question is of more than academic interest. Indeed, the question, after that, It's important to note, though, that the question itself won't be answered overnight. Indeed, the question is not a new one, though it took Anne's characteristic bluntness to put it this directly. There are people here, particularly Ernst Homburg and Lissa Roberts, who would have liked to have been here, who've worked on this topic for quite a while, and who I hope share my view that there is much more to say about applied science in the history of science. Indeed, variants of Anne's question have a very long history, especially in the Netherlands. Some of the finest examples we have of the history of science from the perspective of applied science examine Dutch science, from Harold Cook's study of the commercial influences on botany and anatomy in the Golden Age, to the cottage industry of studies of research at Philips, Unilever, and Shell, by people like Toon van Helvoort, Mille Davids, and David Banneken. Here in Maastricht, history of science, sociology of technology, and innovation studies all complement each other under the umbrella of science and technology studies, which is why this is the only place that I would want to be the chair in the history of science, technology, and innovation. So we're in the right place to ask Anne's question. What if we wrote the history of science from the perspective of applied science? But to answer that question, we first need some definitions. What, after all, is applied science? For most of the late Cold War period, the American policymakers, scientists, engineers, and protesters, who are the central actors in the stories that I tell, routinely used this phrase, applied science, to characterize certain kinds of knowledge-generating activities, usually in contrast with either fundamental or basic science. In STS, of course, we know that applied and basic are social constructions, that different groups have different ways of drawing this boundary or don't draw the boundary at all, and that no rule tells us whether a given piece of research is being carried out to solve a particular problem or to enlarge our understanding of the world. Notably, though, the historical actors who invoked this concept were quite aware of this point. They keenly felt both the interpretive flexibility and the reality of the distinction between basic and applied. For instance, Harvey Brooks, a semiconductor physicist at General Electric and then later at Harvard, and something of a public intellectual in the American applied science community, made this point much better than I could in a 1967 National Academy of Sciences report. There he says, in institutions whose missions include the application of research results to products or operations, the categorization of research into basic or applied is not too meaningful and has little operational value, right? It's just a construction, and we can reconstruct it in different ways. All research in a mission-oriented organization contributes, or should contribute, however remotely in time, to the general objectives of the organization. On the other hand, there is clearly a spectrum of activities ranging from pure research on the one hand to technological development on the other. And to some extent, one can locate research activities within this spectrum according to their appliedness, right? So for Brooks, the spectrum from basic to applied is mere common sense, right? If difficult to define precisely or to use effectively. What he doesn't note, but we can, of course, is that this distinction between basic and applied performs a lot of work. For example, as Donald Mackenzie, Glenn Asner, Benoit Godin, and Phil Murawski have argued, the people who probably used this distinction between basic and applied the most were bean counters. They were accountants, economists, and statisticians. Doing things like, for instance, advising corporations on how to get tax breaks by shifting funds toward basic research, or working in the Pentagon, assigning degrees of appliedness to various procurement contracts, or working in science funding agencies, keeping track of where those agencies' money went. And right there, you can start to see that when historians of science confront the distinction between basic and applied, they find a lot to say about bureaucracies, capitalism, and the national security state, things that we'd all benefit from a better understanding of. So how did the Pentagon's accountants draw the distinction between basic and applied? What determined where a piece of research was situated on Brooks's spectrum of appliedness? Brooks offered two criteria. So one was, quote, the timescale on which research is likely to find an application. And the other was, quote, the specificity with which the domain of application can be foreseen, right? So if you are working in the laboratory and you know exactly how your work will then translate to the battlefield or to the market, however long it takes, then you're doing applied research. But it also, if you're in the laboratory and you know that your research in some form will be on the battlefield or the market in a year or two, then you're also doing applied research. That's Brooks's criteria. But there are many other criteria for distinguishing basic and applied which have been offered over the years. Basic research is sometimes characterized as curiosity-driven and applied as problem-oriented, basic as esoteric, that is, of interest only to specialists, and applied as interdisciplinary, basic as foundational, i.e. what students should learn first, or what actually was discovered first, with applied supposedly coming after that foundation has been laid. All of these criteria are problematic when you look at them more closely. For instance, some people find researching circuits just as curiosity-driven a pursuit as researching quarks or quasars. In many historical episodes, most famously the laws of thermodynamics, supposedly foundational knowledge only emerged long after the applied understanding that led to it. In some eras, science and engineering education does indeed privilege foundational knowledge, that is what students are taught first, but then the pendulum swings, and in other eras, students are taught to start with hands-on techniques first and learn the fundamentals later. Right? So none of these criteria always work. Because these criteria are so arguable, I won't offer a fixed definition of applied science. As Robert Budd puts it, applied science is a phrase in search of a meaning. It's the kind of concept that Nietzsche may have had in mind when he said that only that which has no history can be defined. For me, it's easiest to think of applied science as the type of term that Wittgenstein was thinking about when he talked about these undefinable family resemblances, exemplified here by Wittgenstein himself and his sisters. All the instances of applied science look a bit like each other, though no one feature runs through all of them, and no one rule allows us to determine whether something belongs to this family or not. We do often make that determination, but on the basis of grammars that change as we move from context to context, community to community. And that's one reason why we should ask Ann Johnson's question. Many members of the applied science family are members of other families as well, when viewed from a different perspective. Applied science isn't a domain apart from basic research, nor from plenty of other domains: technology, art, business, diplomacy, government, etc. It's precisely because applied science shades into all of these domains that we should look at those domains from the perspective of applied science, from the viewpoint of people who say, on some occasions, that they are doing applied science, yet who on other occasions might acknowledge that they are doing technology, art, business, government, basic research, etc. In other words, one of the family resemblances that characterizes many, though not all, applied scientists is that they move easily between domains. I noticed this almost 20 years ago now in doing interviews for my PhD thesis. Many of my interviewees had degrees that had science in their names, but when I interviewed them, their current job titles had engineer in their title, or vice versa. A few of them were doing science or engineering when I interviewed them, but had no degrees in those fields. Their backgrounds were in whitewater rafting, or psychology, or even history. Others were trained scientists and engineers, but in their current practice, they were entrepreneurs or grant officers. It can be difficult to categorize such people and to follow them around. Historians of science still divide themselves along lines provided by the scientific disciplines. So people who wander among disciplines often fall off of our radars. Thus, histories of science that prominently feature these wandering applied scientists are still the exception rather than the rule. I don't want to exaggerate this point, but let me offer one anecdote to show that most histories of science are still written from the perspective of basic research rather than from the perspective of applied science. I recently reviewed a volume entitled A Companion to the History of American Science. Quite a good volume, a very good reference, with some chapters that go beyond simple literature review and make very original arguments. And yet, in the 692 pages of this volume, exactly half of one paragraph, and that in a chapter on the field sciences, concerns corporate research. In a volume which includes a chapter on the short-lived nature study movement, there's no chapter on the military. Again, I quite like this volume. It presents a very good picture of the history of American science from the perspective of basic research. It would be unthinkable to write a history of American science from the perspective of applied science without devoting significant space to corporate or military-sponsored research. Yet the editors of this volume didn't think that they had to justify giving very limited room to corporations or the military. nor did they even have to acknowledge that in their volume, basic research stands for all of science. For many historians, that's simply the default. Why is that the case? Well, part of the reason is what my colleague Joe Martin calls the prestige asymmetry between fields which argue for the fundamental nature of their knowledge and fields which gesture to the technological outcomes of their work. Joe uses the pub quiz test to show how prestige accrues more to the one than to the other. Any pub quiz could ask a question about Higgs bosons or quarks, the fundamental particles of basic high-energy physics, yet no quiz could ask about phonons or holes, two of the most useful quasi-particles in the much more applied study of solids. I couldn't find a good picture of a pub quiz, so instead I use a different example that Joe also suggested. The fact this representation shows that you can buy stuffed versions of various high-energy physics particles as toys, yet it would be almost completely unthinkable that you could buy a stuffed version of the particles used in solid-state research. Hasok Chang draws a similar comparison between the prestige accorded to Schrödinger's equation from physics and the utter anonymity of the structural chemistry without which Schrödinger's equation would be largely useless. Now, many reasons for this prestige asymmetry have been advanced. Joe Martin argues for what he calls a purloined letter effect. That is, the need to gesture to technological results robs applied scientists of the chance to imbue their work with sacred meaning in the way that basic researchers routinely do. Basic researchers in high-energy physics, for instance, are allowed to talk about what they do as finding a God particle, whereas solid-state physicists are not. Alternatively, I like Rebecca Press-Schwartz's claim that the American national security state promoted the visibility of basic research starting in the 1940s, precisely because there were no security concerns in doing so, whereas applied science was so valuable that it had to be buried. That then has led to a kind of feedback mechanism. Historical sources relating to applied science have become hard to access, they're confidential or they're classified, while those relating to basic research are much more readily available. Thus, more histories get written about basic science, that's where the historical conversation focuses, and studies of applied science move to the margins because their findings often are difficult to fit with established narratives. Unfortunately, historians haven't adequately acknowledged that we reproduce the science's own prestige asymmetries. Now, I'm walking onto thinner ice here, but I think it's not entirely unfair to say that many historians of science until the 1970s didn't really consider applied science to be science at all. Science for them was an intellectual endeavor, conducted with no thought of gain or utility, aspiring to universal relevance rather than to the solving of specific problems, except under extreme duress or necessity. After the publication of Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions in the early 1960s, attitudes slowly changed, but not in a way that gave much more primacy to people like Harvey Brooks, or his version of what applied science is. Instead, the consensus emerged among historians that all science is applied science in some way, so there's little need to say anything specifically about Brooksian applied science. Galileo was trying to work his way up the patronage ladder in the Medici court. Boyle aimed to reconstruct English society after the Civil War. Newton was an alchemist and a bloodthirsty master of the mint and a religious fanatic. And for all of them, their fundamental discoveries about the universe were applied in those various contexts. Historians of science began to acknowledge that the context of application did inform their cast of characters. Yet the cast itself did not really expand to include people like Harvey Brooks. It has expanded in other ways, particularly in the past 10 years or so, to encompass more women, more people from the working class and the global south, and so on, and rightly so. My point that we should also pay attention to people like Brooks should complement and not distract from the broader diversification of the stories that historians of science tell. Brooks and his colleagues were hardly subalterns. They were influential people. So if we want to understand how science works, we need to pay more attention to how they used that influence, for good and bad. Okay, let me recap. So far, I've put forward Ann Johnson's question: what if we wrote the history of science from the perspective of applied science? I've offered a family resemblance type definition of applied science. I've claimed that many historians of science take basic research to represent all of science and see little need to justify minimal attention to applied fields. And finally, I've given some reasons for that. What I'll do next is give you a better sense of what I mean by writing the history of science from the perspective of applied science, and how that kind of writing might differ from more conventional histories. I'll do that by telling the same story 3 times, once from the perspective of basic research and twice from that of applied science. My case story is that of the discovery of carbon-60, also known as Buckminster fullerene, this sphere-shaped molecule on the right, and eventually of other fullerenes, including carbon nanotubes on the left, and graphene at the upper right. There's quite a thriving subfield of studies of this episode, both popular histories and academic STS research, and I'm particularly indebted to studies by Matt Eisler, Patrick McRae, and Sarah Kaplan and Joanna Radin. Many of the primary documents relating to this episode are housed at not one but 2 of my former employers, Rice University and the Chemical Heritage Foundation, which means that I've had access to some sources that other people haven't, but the bare facts of how C60 was discovered are rather widely known and have mostly been assembled into narratives told from the perspective of basic research, even though, as I'll show, there are definitely other narratives possible. So the usual story about the discovery of C60 begins with an enormous, a room-sized experimental setup known as the AP2, built by the chemist Richard Smalley, there on the left, and his graduate students in the Space Sciences building at Rice University in the early 1980s. The way the AP2 worked was you would have a spinning disk of some material, and then a laser would vaporize little pieces of the disk. Those little pieces would be cooled very close to absolute zero by being blown through a funnel of supersonic helium, and then their spectroscopic signatures would be interrogated with another laser. Smalley built the AP2 in order to study the reactivity of these small clusters. And by the early 1980s, he was using it to essentially work his way through the periodic table, one element after another, a very kind of basic research way of doing things. He was assisted in this by a theoretical chemist named Bob Curl. And at a conference, Curl mentioned this AP2 to a British colleague, Harry Kroto, who immediately saw the AP2 as simulating the conditions of interstellar space, right? Immense heat, as from a star, in this case from a laser, followed by a very intense cold, simulating the conditions of the void of space. Kroto was one of the proponents of a theory that much interstellar matter is composed of long-chain carbon molecules. And he therefore asked Smalley to put a carbon disk in the AP2 to test this idea. After some delay, a few months, Smalley agreed to do so. Kroto flew to Houston, and Smalley's graduate students ran the experiment. Unexpectedly, they found that the AP2 spit out molecules with exactly 60 carbon atoms much, much more frequently than any other number of carbon atoms. You can see this is a very tall spike in this second hillock on the right. And then also similarly anonymous but not quite as tall spike at 70 carbon atoms. After a couple of weeks of wrestling with the question of why this happened, what was special about 60, they came to the conclusion that what they were seeing was the signature of a closed cage molecule in the shape of a classic European football, soccer ball, we would say, or of one of Buckminster Fuller's geodesic domes. Hence, they called this molecule fullerene, right? And you see here, Curl in the middle, Smalley on the left, Kroto on the right, 2 graduate students that I'll get to in a minute. The group quickly published their claims to quite considerable press. This was the third allotrope of carbon after graphite and diamond, right? A completely new form of matter. And yet full acceptance of this idea only came several years later because no one could make enough of this stuff, of C60, in order to find out anything about its properties. The big break that allowed research to move forward was in 1990 when two astrophysicists figured out that you could create reasonable quantities of C60 by sparking an arc generator in a low-pressure helium environment. Suddenly, fullerene research took off, moving rapidly from spherical C60 to elongated carbon nanotubes, and then a little over a decade later to flat sheets of graphene. Smalley, Curl, and Kroto won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1996, and Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2010 for isolating graphene, right? So this has been a celebrated discovery. Not all, but most tellings of this conventional version emphasize the basic research aspect, particularly the importance of astrochemistry, astrophysics, and space science, right? What could be a more basic research, seemingly useless, curiosity-driven kind of question than asking what composes the matter between stars? And I think there's great historical and societal value in telling the story in that way. We do need to foster research, which is motivated more by mystery than by application. I'm persuaded by people like Phil Murawski, Paul Foreman, Hans Rader, that a research system eventually becomes sclerotic, inegalitarian, and dysfunctional if it only prizes application and casts curiosity aside. Yet we can't have a healthy research system, which has lots of basic research, if we don't have an understanding of how basic and applied research interact. If we only have histories of science from the perspective of basic research, we won't actually be able to understand the conditions which foster basic research. And that's where I would like to stake a claim to the relevance, to the valorizatsi of my own research. So far, I've presented Ann Johnson's question and my take on it as a basic research preoccupation, and identified this gap in the literature, and I've been describing how we might fill it without really asking whether it's a gap that needed to be filled. But the history of science from the perspective of applied science is of more than academic interest. Our popular culture increasingly takes for granted that science is equivalent to technology. Our political systems increasingly take for granted that the only science worth supporting is that which leads to new technologies. Those are ideas worth contesting, yet we need to contest those ideas in ways which don't replace them with other fallacies. So let me make that point concrete by retelling the fullerene story from the perspective of two applied fields. In my recent book, The Long Arm of Moore's Law, Microelectronics in American Science, I show that the conventional telling misses Rick Smalley's abiding desire to connect his research to the microelectronics industry. What was Smalley putting into the AP2 before Kroto asked him to zap carbon? Almost none of the conventional versions of the discovery of C60 ask this, but if you look, he was putting silicon and gallium arsenide into the AP2, the two main semiconductor materials used in commercial microelectronics. In fact, one of the graduate students involved in the C60 discovery, Sean O'Brien on the left in the cap, went from Rice to work in semiconductor physics at Texas Instruments. Another graduate student, Jim Heath, the one on the right, became one of the biggest names in the field of molecular electronics, a field in which single molecules, sometimes carbon nanotubes or graphene, are used to replace solid-state microelectronic components. In the 5-year period in the late 1980s, when no one could make significant quantities of C60, Smalley started to get tired of fullerenes and moved back toward semiconductor research. I found a presentation by one of his graduate students from this era entitled, "Silicon is Never Boring," I think in contrast to the state of C60 research at that point. When fullerene research did rebound in the early 1990s, Smalley was among the very first to drop C60 and move on to other fullerenes, particularly carbon nanotubes, because they had greater potential as components in circuits. Indeed, nanotube research really only had this second wave because of discoveries of how to make carbon nanotubes at two electronics firms, NEC and IBM. The social capital Smalley acquired from the C60 discovery and from the Nobel Prize was spent largely on convincing Rice to hire people in fields related to molecular electronics. And when Smalley founded a company to manufacture nanotubes, the main market that he targeted was electronics firms such as Samsung and Apple. Smalley's imaginary for how and why fullerene research should be done was always oriented to microelectronics. If you tell the history of fullerenes from the perspective of astrochemistry or astrophysics, you miss this influence of microelectronics. But if, on the other hand, you tell this story from the perspective of microelectronics, you quickly see that many fields in the natural sciences, including very basic fields in biology and astronomy, have been shaped and often facilitated by the demands of the semiconductor industry. So for several years now, that's been the alternative story about C60 that I've tried to promote. Not to undermine or discredit the usual story that centers on astrochemistry, but to complement it. This one case nicely summarizes my research program of the past decade or so. But let me now look forward to where my research will go now that I'm at Maastricht. Recently, I've become interested in the oil industry's wide-ranging influence over global research. Influence which rivals or outpaces that of microelectronics, and which is sometimes pernicious, but often surprisingly progressive. I'm particularly intrigued that in the 1970s, firms such as Shell were major sponsors of solar energy R&D and nuclear power, and of even a few early important biotechnology firms. A few oil executives were even champions of several important environmental organizations, as I've learned from several people here today, Ernst Homburg, Simone Schleper, Ralph de Bont. These connections aren't exactly secret, yet historians haven't done much with them. Partly, I would say, because they aren't used to telling the history of science from the perspective of applied science. For instance, there's quite a lot of work by people like Nicholas Rasmussen and Du Gabier, which tells the history of biotechnology from the perspective of basic research in the life sciences. But hardly anyone, perhaps with the exception of Robert Budd, has cast much light on why those fields, why that industry might have been supported by oil firms. It's quite a mystery. The research program I would like to carry out over the next several years, therefore, would squarely confront that mystery. We need to know why oil firms invested so heavily in alternative energy and environmentalism in the 1970s. Were they sincere? Were they cynically trying to undermine these fields? Or were they perhaps hedging their bets in a period of great uncertainty? Given that they did make these investments, what happened to them? Do biotechnology, nuclear power, and solar energy still bear oil's fingerprints? How did some of the leading firms in the oil industry, such as Exxon and Shell, move from seeing their interests as aligned, at least partially, with environmentalists and alternative energy advocates, to believing by the 1990s that their interests were best served by alignment with climate denialists? As I've begun to explore these questions, it's recently dawned on me that the fullerene story can also be told from the perspective of petrochemistry. Rick Smalley's connections to microelectronics were almost entirely imagined. He thought maybe someday he would be a big player in that industry. But his connections to oil were real, and they were varied. After college, he worked at Shell Research for several years. When he arrived at Rice University, he immediately had access to research funding both from oil firms and from philanthropies founded by oil executives, most notably the Welch Foundation. Exxon even paid him to build a replica of the AP2 for use by their own researchers. Though as far as I can tell, that research was oriented more to Exxon's involvement in nuclear energy than to its dominance of oil. In fact, this Exxon team had already published an article in which they almost saw the C60 anomaly, but dismissed it, right? So they took their replica of the AP2, they zapped a carbon disk, And this is what they got. You can see there's a little bit of a spike at C60, but not so large a spike that it drew their attention. And this was published about a year before Smalley, Kroto, and Curl looked at carbon themselves. It also turned out that fullerenes, especially multi-walled nanotubes, had been noticed but not really commented on for decades by researchers working on soot, for example, soot in the residue of combustion. Later, in the 1990s, Smalley's group gained a reputation for making extremely high-quality nanotubes using a synthesis technique borrowed from the petrochemical industry. Hence, when Smalley founded his startup company, he brought in veterans from that industry in order to run it. In other words, the history of fullerene research is shot through with debts to oil, even though the fullerene research community has mostly generated quite basic research with little direct relevance to oil. Nor is fullerene research unique. Many basic research fields are awash in money, personnel, tools, materials, and ideas borrowed from oil. There's even a connection here to sound studies, a field associated with Karen Meisterfeld, in the sense that many of the techniques for processing seismic waves have also been applied to music over the years. Perhaps the signature sound of our own era, auto-tuned pop music, was in fact developed by veterans of the oil industry. As we head toward an economy that is less dependent on oil, we should start planning now for a research system in which oil has less influence over the research agenda. Keeping in mind that that could also be a research system where oil firms are less able to provide the resources that circulate people, tools, materials, and ideas, resources that we have become dependent upon without even knowing it. My hope is that my research program can contribute to deliberation about oil's role in innovation, innovation's role in the oil industry's failure to confront climate change, and the organization of innovation in the hopefully fast-approaching world that is less dependent on oil. These aren't hypothetical or esoteric questions, as shown, I think, by two news items that appeared within a couple of weeks of each other earlier this year. One is an announcement of a collaboration between our own university and Saudi Aramco, the Saudi national oil company, to research the sustainability of bio-based materials in a circular economy. The other is a story in De Correspondent, a newspaper which often engages in dialogue with science and technology studies and history of science and technology, about Shell's much larger and seemingly more questionable sponsorship of a number of programs at Erasmus University Rotterdam. Former, the announcement of what is doing, quite celebratory. The latter, Jelmer Mommer's article about Shell, quite accusatory. So how should we as citizens, as members of a university community, and as academics who study the history, sociology, and ethics of science and technology, think about these two seemingly quite similar partnerships? To get some guidance on that question, I want to close the circle and come back to Ann Johnson. Ann's articles asking, what if we wrote the history of science from the perspective of applied science, were written with situations like this one very much in mind. She's explicitly talking about exactly this topic in those articles. Her view was that we can't yet grapple with the complexities of industrial sponsorship of academic research because most philosophy and history of science is still written from the perspective of basic research. That is, much of the academic debate about the propriety of partnerships like these proceeds, sometimes explicitly, sometimes not, from the view that applied science isn't quite science, that it isn't as open or impartial as science ought to be, that it isn't really motivated by curiosity or wonder, that it isn't as generalizable or rigorous as real science. And no doubt that's true of much applied science, but not all. For instance, when Anne died, she was working on a book about engineers in the early American Republic. These were among the very first people to put the study of materials on anything like a rigorous scientific footing. And yet, because they did so as part of an effort to build forts and canals and harbors, most histories don't regard them, really almost any 19th century Americans, as scientists at all. If, however, you write the history of science from the perspective of applied science, then it quickly becomes clear that applied scientists are very much driven by curiosity and wonderment, that they are at least as rigorous as their basic research peers, and that much of their job lies, if not in generalizing, then in adapting their ideas from one domain to another. It also very quickly becomes clear that basic research, too, has interested patrons who are not so different from Shell or Saudi Aramco. We know a great deal about the Higgs boson, for instance, because building giant particle accelerators was considered useful for European integration and for the vote trading which led to the 1965 Civil Rights Act in the United States. So Anne's view is that we need a history of science from the perspective of applied science in order to understand how unusual or problematic partnerships like these really are. We also need histories from the perspective of basic research, of course. My point all along has been that we need both basic and applied science, and that we need histories that are oriented to both basic and applied science. With such an understanding at our fingertips, we might still conclude that arrangements such as these are problematic. I don't want to drain the history of science of its cynicism. But cynicism must contend with complexity. Critiques such as Jelmer Mommer's, for instance, assume that sponsors determine findings. Yet at least 2 generations of historians of science have tried and failed to achieve consensus on exactly that question, whether the sponsor was the national security state or private enterprise. Sometimes, of course, sponsors do seem to determine outcomes. But just as often, scientists seem to be quite good at gaming the system, at taking sponsorship and doing whatever they like. For instance, our best evidence for climate change, the so-called Keeling curve, exists because the US Air Force wanted to know how radio communications would be affected by a nuclear war. Moreover, while critiques such as Mommer's are important, sometimes they miss the factors that most affect the research system. As David Kaiser has shown, for instance, the US military's support for physics during the Cold War didn't cripple basic research into things like subatomic particles. Just the opposite, right? Since high energy research was heavily invested in by the Pentagon. But military patronage did incentivize the use of mathematical tools, such as Feynman diagrams, on which people could be trained quickly, right? So that you could produce large numbers of PhDs, and discouraged more philosophically intensive topics such as relativity and quantum entanglement. Similarly, Paula Steffen has shown that the economic incentives which have most distorted American science have not been patents or contributions from private firms, but rather changes in pension plans and the retirement age, which have hindered younger scholars from attaining tenured positions or winning grant competitions. In my own research, I've come across the complexity of public and private, basic and applied, time and again. For instance, my first book was about a class of microscopes which were invented and initially developed in private firms, particularly IBM and AT&T. It was only thanks to those firms that the technology matured to the point where a global community of academic researchers could grow around it. Still, even at that point, everyone in that community had to build their own microscope until eventually a professor at the University of California decided to commercialize his departmental colleague's design. Just the kind of privatization of publicly funded research which many STS scholars are critical of. And rightly so, sometimes. Although in this case, a great deal of publicly available basic research has only become possible because academic scientists can now buy microscopes instead of having to build them themselves. Conversely, my current research is on public sector science in the 1970s. Here I think you can make a case that at the end of the 70s, private interests did curtail the academic and government research into environmental problems, disability technologies, mass transportation, and public housing, which had boomed at the beginning of that decade. But that early 70s boom in public sector research had only erupted thanks to a backlash against basic research, a backlash promoted largely by anti-war and left-leaning activists who believed, with some justification, that scientists were using their dedication to basic research to avoid taking responsibility for their complicity in the Vietnam War and in order to discourage their students from becoming politically aware. The politics of basic and applied, public and private, can get very complicated indeed. Thus, there are few reliable benchmarks for judging cases like these. Instead, we have to look to perspectives, especially from science and technology studies, which allow for complexity, such as actor network theory or the co-productionist framework most associated with Sheila Jasanoff. In this case, I would say that both A&T and co-production would encourage us to ask something like, what kind of world comes into being when partnerships like these are allowed? And is that a world in which we would like to live? Writing the history of science from the perspective of both applied and basic research helps us to imagine those possible future worlds and to deliberate alongside sociologists, anthropologists, philosophers, other STS practitioners, and other stakeholders as to whether or not those are the future worlds that we want. In other words, writing histories which run back and forth across Harvey Brooks' spectrum of appliedness allows us to see aspects of those imagined futures which unsettle reflex responses such as basic research good or oil bad. When I think about the discovery of C60 in the way that Ann Johnson taught me to see, I don't think she would have been at all concerned that Rick Smalley was funded by oil companies or that he patented his publicly funded research or used public funds to seed a startup company. For her, those were long-standing facets of applied science without which you really could not sustain basic science. But she would have been concerned that the discovery of a new allotrope of carbon and the Nobel Prize awarded for it allowed Rick Smalley and Harry Kroto to build up personal fiefdoms centered on their charismatic authority, in which they determined the fates of dozens of students and colleagues. That was a dynamic Anne herself contended with throughout her career and warned against often. And yet, she persisted. I started this talk with a picture of Anne, the professional academic, dignified and reading in her office. This, though, was the Anne that I remember most. So I invite you to emulate her in this particular and to ponder how you might emulate her in other ways as well. Thank you.
Dear Professor Mody, dear Cyrus, congratulations with this inspiring inaugural speech. It's clear from your presentation that the history of applied science can still bring very many new perspectives to the history of science more broadly. Your approach to tell the story from the history of science from different perspectives, applied as well as basic science, was very illuminating, and it made me think of actually another great scholar, Graham Allison, who actually described the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis from different political science perspectives and actually impressed upon us the importance of bureaucratic politics. And as you will know, his book is still very popular today and still very much used in classrooms. And I also very much hope that your own research will inspire many new colleagues and students, and that you will also be as successful as he has been. You have dedicated your speech, your inaugural speech, to Ann Johnson, somebody whose work meant a lot to you. And all of us in academia can only actually be inspired and do what we are doing because of the work of our predecessors. And I think it's important from time to time to remind us of this. Cyrus, you have been with us for a little more than 2 years. The Dutch academic world must be quite different from what you have known in the US. Your life in Maastricht must also be quite different from the life, from the time when you were still walking around on the campus of Rice University. Still, whenever I talk to you, you seem to be very relaxed. I never hear you complaining, and you seem to have very quickly found your way here in Maastricht and have found a nice home at the faculty. And I'm sure that I'm speaking on behalf of all our colleagues here present, that it is a great pleasure to have such an inspiring, competent and friendly colleague with us at the faculty now. I can therefore only hope that you will stay with us for many, many years, also once there is a new president in the White House. So on these words, I also would like to invite the audience and all the colleagues and family and friends who have joined us today for a drink and a toast on Cyrus. So those who are afraid to get lost, just follow the red gowns. Thank you.